For the first time ever on the podcast, I am going to have to eat my words because we're about to review a movie this week that I had sworn I would never watch.
You are listening to the Cabin of Horrors podcast. Go behind the scenes of all your favorite horror movies from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and now. I am your host, the incredible Josh.
Welcome everyone to the season 2 finale of the Cabin of Horrors podcast. Can you believe that we've already gone through 2 whole seasons? Well, technically 3, like if you count season 0. I try not to, but if you count season 0, this would be the 3rd season. But really, in terms of the chronological order of Cabin of Horrors episodes, this would be the 2nd season. And this episode wraps us up. This is the 13th episode of season 2, and it's a very special episode because it's going to be a triple feature episode. We're going to be going over 3 different movies on this episode of the podcast. Reason being is because, well, you may have noticed that there was a movie missing last week from the Scream 6 review. We didn't continue our Decade in Review series. Reason being, well, technical difficulties happen. And the review that I had recorded for Child's Play, it just mysteriously disappeared. And I had no time to re-record it, in all honesty. So this week, we're going to go over Child's Play, and we're also going to go over Pet Sematary, as we have reviewed an 80s movie from every single year of the 1980s during this season of the podcast, which is absolutely awesome. I had a ton of fun going over 80s movies, and there's so many more to go over, so I cannot wait until we circle back to the 80s in our Decade in Review series. But next season, we already have our decade picked, and I should never have put it out to a poll. On Instagram, probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago now, I put out a poll on what decade everyone wanted to go to for the next season. And it was a very tight race. I'm pretty sure it was like 23% of the votes is what won it for the 1970s. And I know you're probably sitting there going, well, why don't I want to go to the 1970s? Why would that be a big issue? Well, if you are an avid listener of this podcast, you probably already know the answer to this question. That answer is because, well, I'm going to have to go over The Exorcist now. Literally the only movie that to this day terrifies and frightens me and rocks me to my core. But I'm going to have to rewatch The Exorcist now and review it as part of the 70s Decade in Review series, because you can't have a review of 70s horror movies and not go over The Exorcist, right? But this week, we're not only hitting 2 movies from the 80s, we're also going to be talking about a film that I swore I would never watch. If you listened to last season of the podcast, there's an episode where we went over X, the film by Ty West and A24, and I talked about how it was the most overrated horror movie of 2022. And I still stand by that. My opinion on X has not wavered. It has not changed whatsoever. I stand by the words that I spoke about X on that podcast episode, and I also shared that I wouldn't be watching Pearl, because there's no point. What would be the point of me watching the sequel to X, which is technically a prequel, when I hated X so much and thought it was absolutely stupid and totally overrated? Well, then I found out that Helena Bonham Carter and Kevin Bacon, which are literally 2 of my favorite actors, are going to be playing in Maxine, which is the 3rd film in this fucked up X trilogy by Ty West and A24. So because of that, I know the chances of me wanting to watch Maxine are going to be high. I've already seen the first one. I like Helena Bonham Carter and Kevin Bacon. I want to see what they add to this. So I guess now I have to watch Pearl to know what the fuck is going on in Maxine. Many people even told me as well, after that episode that I released on X, told me to watch Pearl. They told me that if I watched Pearl, I'd have this newfound appreciation for X, and everything would be well again. I would eat my words on what I said about X, and I would think it's one of the greatest, most elevated horror movies of 2022 and earlier, because Pearl was so great and added so much to the lore. And it did, Pearl added to, what we saw in X, and it gave more of a backstory and kind of some sort of what the fuck is going on idea when it came to the character Pearl. But did it give me a newfound look on X? No. did it make me change my opinion on X? No, absolutely not. Not in any way. Now, I'll share my thoughts on Pearl throughout the episode here. We're going to dive in, we're going to go behind the scenes, talk about Pearl. So, the script for Pearl was being written by Ty West during the production of X. I'm pretty sure as well that X and Pearl were actually filmed, it was either simultaneously or back to back. Because Pearl came out last year. Like Pearl and X are both 2022 horror movies. And it's very rare for a franchise to drop two movies in the same year. It's very rare to do that, but we knew Pearl was coming at the end of X because they had given, I think it was the post-credit scene, was pretty much the trailer of Pearl. So we knew there was going to be another installment. We knew there was going to be a movie centered around Pearl. And Mia Goth does reprise her role as Pearl from the movie X. Now, if you didn't know this, Mia Goth actually did play two roles in X. She played Maxine, and she also played the old lady Pearl. Now, she's playing the younger version of that old lady from X in this prequel film. Now, Ty West stated that Pearl started from a story that he had collaborated on with Mia Goth, and he had seen it either as becoming a potential film or just serving as a backstory for Goth's role as Pearl in the first movie. West stated that he had pitched his idea of a new franchise to A24, and he was 100% surprised when they greenlit his projects, and I'm sure many of us were as well. West also stated that he intended each film to have its own distinct style and genre of horror. His approach to X he described as heavily influenced by the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, which is no surprise because if you listen to my thoughts on X, I talk about how literally, like, opening scene, the house on the farm, everything screams and feels Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's almost like they ripped it off completely. It's one of those situations where they didn't get inspiration, they stole the homework. And he described Pearl as a Douglas Sirk melodrama meeting the Technicolor style of Mary Poppins and the Wizard of Oz. Something like a demented Disney movie, and he said it will explore how Hollywood filmmaking has influenced society. And West is going to continue this trend of exploring diverse styles and genres in future installments of this franchise. So it may not even end with Maxine. Like, we know we're getting a trilogy, and we're getting Maxine coming out later this year, but this could turn into more than a trilogy. This could turn into a franchise of even more movies, but we probably won't find out until Maxine is released or shortly thereafter. Principal photography had begun in secret immediately following the completed photography on X. Nobody knew that Pearl was shooting. It was a complete secret. Nobody even knew a sequel was greenlit, considering X hadn't even come out yet. Filming on Pearl started in New Zealand and took place back to back with the first movie, and they used some of the same sets that were built for X, which is obvious. You can tell when you're watching Pearl that the farm is the exact same set that they used for X. Pearl went on to have its world premiere at the 79th Venice International Film Festival on September 3rd, 2022, and was then released in theaters in the United States and Canada on September 16th, 2022. Now for the box office, because that's what really matters when it comes to a horror franchise. In the US and Canada, Pearl was projected to gross around $4 million on its opening weekend. The film made $1.3 million on its first day, and then went on to get $3.1 million, finishing third at the box office, and then made $1.92 million in its second weekend. So it made a total box office at the end of the day of $9.7 million on a budget of $1 million. So it made $8.7 million. There's going to be a franchise. Like, we already know there's a third movie, and if Maxine does well, I would be very surprised if there was not another entry in this franchise. But if Maxine tanks, I can see them seeing the wells run dry. Let's not continue this story. We have a trilogy. Let's live with it and just cut it completely. It's going to really depend on how Maxine performs that opening weekend, whether or not this franchise is going to be greenlit. Overall, Pearl wasn't a bad film. I actually did enjoy Pearl more than I enjoyed X. But did I enjoy Pearl overall? Not really. just because it wasn't my jam. It's not my kind of horror movie. It had great kills, it had great effects, the filmography, spectacular. It's truly a period piece. The film is set in 1918 during a war period, and you can really feel that throughout the story, throughout the environment, throughout the filmography. You can feel that that time period is present. So they did a great job of bringing that time period into the film and making you feel like you were watching a period piece, while at the same time it was super fucked up. Like, it was pretty fucked up in terms of the story, where they took it, how Pearl killed people. Like, it was a fucked up story, but it was good. Like, I did enjoy Pearl more than I enjoyed X. Would I watch it again? No. Would I recommend it to people that like elevated horror and this kind of period work? Yeah, I would. I'd recommend Pearl over X any day of the week. But without further ado, let's dive in. Let's talk about the plot of Pearl and everything that happens in this prequel, sequel. What do you want to call it? So the year is 1918, and right in the middle of the influenza pandemic, which is ironic considering they're filming this during the coronavirus pandemic. We meet Pearl as a young woman. She's living with her German immigrant parents on their Texas homestead while her husband, Howard, serves in World War I. Pearl's father is paralyzed, and her domineering mother, Ruth, insists that she helps care for both him and the farm itself. Pearl, she's longing for a way more exciting life than what she already has, and she's been captivated by the films that she sees at the local cinema, so she aspires to become a chorus girl, much to her mother's disapproval, of course. However, Pearl also shows signs of being somewhat disturbed because she starts killing farm animals and is seen physically abusing her father. Later on, we see Pearl at the movie theater, and she meets a young projectionist who takes a liking to her. While she's riding her bicycle home, Pearl ends up stomping along a cornfield and begins dancing with a scarecrow. While doing so, she starts having a fantasy about the projectionist and begins masturbating with the scarecrow. Warned you guys that this was disturbing and fucked up. Now I hope you believe me. Later on, Pearl's mother realizes that 8 cents is missing from an errand that Pearl had completed, so Pearl gets berated about being careless and has her supper completely withheld. We then meet Pearl's affluent sister-in-law, Mitzi, who tells her of an audition that's being held to find new dancers for a traveling troupe, which Pearl totally sees as way out of her league, not something that she's going to be able to take part in. However, she sneaks out of the house later at night and visits the projectionist, who shows her a free ride, which is an illicit porn film that he acquired from France. He starts encouraging Pearl to pursue her dreams, but Pearl comments that she can't abandon her family and that she wishes they would just die. Later that night at dinner, Ruth ends up finding a program that Pearl had taken from the movie theater, so the two of them get in a fierce argument over it during dinner, and a physical altercation erupts, which during this, Pearl shoves her mother against the kitchen hearth and ignites her dress and results in her suffering life-threatening burns. Pearl then drags her mother's body into the basement and leaves her father seated in the kitchen. She heads off to the movie theater, where she ends up having sex with the projectionist. Later the next morning, the projectionist drives Pearl back to the farm so she can prepare for this audition that she's been looking forward to. While the two of them are at the farm, the projectionist sees a maggot-infested roast that was left for Ruth the day prior, tons of inconsistencies that Pearl's telling him, and she's being totally dramatic, so he decides he's going to try and leave. This sends Pearl into a complete fit of rage because, well, now she's being abandoned, and she ends up stabbing him to death with a pitchfork before pushing his car and his corpse into a pond, where he gets attacked and eaten by the alligator, which, if you've seen X, sure you remember the alligator. Pearl then heads back to the house, dresses herself in one of Ruth's lavish gowns, and dresses up her father before smothering him to death. Now it's time for Pearl's big audition. She arrives at the church where the audition's being held, and she gives a dance performance, which she feels is going to win over all the talent scouts. However, she's devastated when she gets rejected because she's not young, blonde, or quote-unquote all-American. So Mitzi accompanies Pearl home in an attempt to try to console her and make sure she's okay. While they're in the kitchen, Pearl confesses to Mitzi about her resentment towards Howard, who came from a privileged background but insisted that the couple remain on her family's farm, and admits that she was relieved when she miscarried his child, has joy in acts of harm, and taking the lives of her parents and the projectionist. This totally stuns Mitzi, and she's then manipulated by Pearl into confessing that she's the one who actually won the audition over Pearl. This sends Pearl into a complete jealousy fit, and Pearl chases Mitzi down the driveway and kills her with an axe. She then begins to dismember Mitzi's body and feeds her corpse to the alligator before going into the basement and lying down with Ruth, who is dead. She concludes that her mother was correct and that Pearl should make the best of what she has. So she decides she's going to remediate her wrongdoings by creating a comfortable home for Howard when he returns home from the war. The next morning, well, Howard arrives unexpectedly. They're standing in the kitchen, and he's horrified to find the bodies of Pearl's parents seated at the dining table around the rotting pig. Pearl greets him with a protracted, pained smile that she holds all the way through to the end credits. And I'm sure you've seen the meme of it, of the big smile with the eyes watering, and that ends us off on Pearl. Decent film, right? Like, for what it is, for the filmography, for the time that it's set, it's a great period piece. And it's a good commentary on how filmmaking has had an impact on society. And it's also had an impact on how us as people see the world. It impacts what we want to do with our life. It impacts how we act in society. A lot of people will look at movies not necessarily as real, but almost as a sort of template, right? Like, this is how life can be, or this is how life should be. That's how some people look at movies. They're unable to look at it as, this is fiction. This is a universe and a world that doesn't exist. Could it exist? Well, anything's possible in this world, but does it? No. So this kind of commentary really highlights the fact that it's important to remember that films are fiction. They are a world and a universe that we cannot be a part of, and is not something that is the same as ours. That's why we watch films. We watch films to escape, to get a glimpse into another world that is not ours and that does not exist. Especially with horror. Do you want horror movies to exist? Do you want to wake up in the morning and have to be running from Michael or Freddy or Jason every freaking day? No. Come on. Like, let's be real. You don't want to do that, right? But you watch these movies when you want to, so that when you do want to run from Michael, you can, right? But it's not our world. It is fiction. And I do like that commentary that Pearl has about that taking it too far, getting too involved in movies and letting it take over your life in a way that it's all encompassing of you can be unhealthy. And this is what happens when you push that too far. You get Pearl. And I know it doesn't help that, she had a disturbed background before she even got into that kind of thing. But when you have that kind of environment and that kind of mentality, movies are just a perfect escape for you to get out those feelings, right? But that wraps us up for our review on Pearl. Now we're going to head into our 80s Decade in Review series and talk about the first film of this episode, Child's Play. Which, if you don't know Child's Play, you are living under a rock. But you will know Chucky. You know Chucky the Killer Doll. If you don't know Chucky the Killer Doll, God, you need to really, really dive into this. But I'm sure you do. I'm sure 98% of you know at least who Chucky the Killer Doll is. So Child's Play was released in 1988 and was directed by Tom Holland from a screenplay that was created by Holland, Don Mancini, and John Lafia, based on a story that was developed by Don Mancini. And this is the first film in the Child's Play franchise. And according to an interview with Mental Floss, Don Mancini first conceived the concept of this while studying as a film major at the University of California. Mancini was also heavily influenced by Cabbage Patch Kids, Trilogy of Terror, Magic, Poltergeist, and the character of Freddy Krueger from A Nightmare on Elm Street, of course, along with the Twilight Zone episode Living Doll. Mancini's original script for Child's Play was titled Batteries Not Included, and the title was later changed to Blood Buddy after it was discovered that a different film with the same name was already being made. And then during production, it was nearly retitled again because they wanted to avoid confusion with the 1972 horror film of the same name. And the screenplay would have featured a doll that was filled with fake blood that would bleed if it was played with too roughly, and it would have come alive after Andy mixed his own blood with the doll's. And the doll would have been a representation of Andy's suppressed rage and would have targeted all of Andy's enemies. Mancini's original script, it played a lot like a whodunit story, which dealt with the effect of advertising and television on children. And it was also developed to toy with the audience a little bit, making it ambiguous as to whether or not Andy or Chucky was the killer. The voice of Chucky in Child's Play also went through a lot of changes, and there was some interesting voices that were actually recorded before they landed on the voice we have now. So initially, the voice of the Chucky doll was intended to be just a simple electronic overlay, similar to ordinary doll toys that we hear now with sound chips, right? It kind of sounds technologically. Or I guess like they would have sounded in the 80s, right? It's a little bit different how dolls sound now compared to how they sounded in the 80s. However, this was deemed infeasible, and Brad Dourif was unavailable to record Chucky's voice at that time because he was involved in spontaneous combustion. So Holland decided to cast Jessica Walter to voice Chucky, on the basis that Mercedes McCambridge had voiced Pazuzu in The Exorcist. However, later those recordings were discarded, and she was replaced with John Franklin, who completed his lines as well, but was replaced ultimately when Dourif returned to the film. Because we all know that the voice of Chucky has and always will be Brad Dourif. Well, I shouldn't say always will be. I shouldn't say always will be, because you don't know what will happen 10, 20 years from now, but I hope Brad Dourif continues to be the voice of Chucky for as long as he can. Principal photography on Child's Play began on January 7th, 1988, and wrapped up on March 5th, 1988, with a budget between $9 to $13 million. It was also filmed on location in Chicago. The Brewster Apartments, which is a Chicago landmark located at Diversey Parkway and Pine Grove Avenue, is what served as the location of the apartment where Andy and Karen lived, and is the same one that's featured on the film's poster. And fun fact as well is that Chucky's full name is Charles Lee Ray. That's the name of the man who dies and puts his soul into the Chucky doll. And it's actually derived from the names of notorious serial killers in real life: Charles Manson, Lee Harvey Oswald, and James Earl Ray. So there's your fun fact for where the name of Charles Lee Ray came from. Now, of course, there was tons of visual effects in this film, right? Well, the biggest visual effects would be coming from the Chucky doll. And they used various ways to portray Chucky. They included radio-controlled animatronics that were operated by up to 9 puppeteers. They also had extras and child actors who would help do different running scenes to make Chucky look more real-like during the movie. And throughout the film, Chucky transitions from appearing as a normal toy to appearing more human as the film progresses. This includes his hairline receding throughout the film. And there was multiple Chucky animatronics that were created, such as a flailing tantrum Chucky, a walking Chucky, and a stationary Chucky. Personally, I kind of want a flailing tantrum Chucky. I think that would be cool. They should release a flailing tantrum Chucky doll, because I would be all over it and buy it. And the face of the Chucky doll was controlled via a remote control through a rig capturing facial movement on puppeteer Brock Winkless. And when the film went to test screening, it initially received negative reviews because it was about a 2-hour rough cut that was shown to audiences at the test screening, and we know that we get a lot less of a 2-hour movie when it comes to Child's Play. So they decided to cut about 25 minutes of the film to reduce the amount of time that Chucky was on screen. And it's something that they did because they wanted to build suspense in a similar fashion to Jaws or Alien. The test screening also featured the use of Walter as the doll's voice. And they claimed that the voice was suitably menacing, but it wasn't able to convey the humor that was intended for the character. So they had all of her lines redubbed with Dourif's voice. So then they released Child's Play, and it was produced on a budget between $9 to $13 million, and MGM made a controversial decision to not release the film during Halloween. Instead, they released it closer to Veterans Day weekend, which I don't know why you wouldn't want to release a horror movie around Halloween. Unless, of course, there was a Halloween movie coming out or a Friday the 13th movie coming out. It is 1988, so, there could have been other movies, but I feel like still making it close to Halloween would have been a good decision for them. But at the same time, they didn't make the wrong decision, because it was released on November 9th, 1988, and opened at number 1, and made $6,583,963 on the opening weekend. So they obviously didn't make any mistakes. And the film went on to gross $33,244,684 at the US box office, and in total worldwide made $44,196,684. It actually became the second highest grossing film of 1988, following Rain Man. So the only movie that made more money than Child's Play in 1988 was Rain Man. And we know how iconic and, good of a movie Rain Man is. Child's Play was right behind it for box office bank in 1988. That's incredible. That just goes to show you how much horror was loved and renowned. It is time now, though, to dive into the plot of Child's Play, talk about everything that happens, and how Chucky began to slash his way into our lives. The film starts off with a chase between Detective Mike Norris and serial killer Charles Lee Ray. They are running through the streets of Chicago and land into a toy store. Charles ends up getting shot by Norris and begins to perform a voodoo chant which will transfer his soul into one of the Good Guy brand talking dolls that are on display at the store. While performing the ritual, the store is struck by lightning and explodes. Norris finds Charles Lee Ray dead lying on the ground next to this doll. We then meet Karen Barclay, who has a 6-year-old son named Andy who desperately wants a Good Guy doll for his birthday. Unfortunately, Karen being a single mom, she's unable to afford one. Soon after, though, she finds out that there's a homeless man outside of her work that has actually gotten a hold of a Good Guy doll, and he's trying to get rid of it, he's trying to sell it. So she ends up buying the doll and gives it to Andy. Doll appears normal and refers to itself as Chucky, and later that night, Karen's best friend Maggie is going to be babysitting Andy because Karen needs to work late. Andy gets sent to bed, and Maggie finds Chucky sitting in front of a television tuned to a late-night newscast that's talking about the death of Charles Lee Ray. She then gets attacked by Chucky, which causes her to fall out of the window to her death. Police show up, they search the apartment, and Detective Norris is there, the same one who was chasing down Charles Lee Ray. He considers Andy to be a suspect, despite the fact that his mom is saying there's no way he could have done this. Andy claims that it was Chucky who killed Maggie, and says that Chucky told him his real name was Charles Lee Ray. The next morning, Chucky orders Andy to skip school and take a train with him downtown. He decides to do so, and while Andy gets distracted, Chucky sneaks into the home of his former accomplice, Eddie Caputo. He ends up killing him by causing a gas explosion. Once again, of course, Andy is considered a suspect, and he gets admitted to a psychiatric hospital because he keeps claiming that Chucky the Killer doll is the culprit. Karen returns home with Chucky, and then she discovers that the batteries are still in the doll's box. Yet the doll's been moving and speaking without them? So Karen gets frightened, she lights up her fireplace and threatens to burn Chucky. At this point, he comes alive violently in her arms and attacks her before he escapes. Karen then goes to the police station and explains what happened, but no one believes her. Who's going to believe this mom that's trying to, save her kid from a psychiatric facility by saying some plastic doll is the one that's committing all the murders? Well, Karen then decides that she's going to take matters into her own hands, and she tracks down the homeless guy that she had bought the doll from originally and begins to ask him for more information. At the same time, Detective Norris shows up and interrogates the man as well, forcing him to admit that he took the doll from the burnt-down toy store where Charles Lee Ray was killed. So Karen keeps trying to convince him that the doll is alive, but he insists that he killed Charles Lee Ray and there's no way that this doll has the soul of a serial killer. So the detective ends up bringing Karen home. However, he gets attacked by Chucky, and in the ensuing fight, he ends up shooting the doll. And we see that he's now wounded, and Chucky bleeds and can feel pain. Chucky escapes, and he heads over to his former voodoo instructor, John, who informs him that the longer his soul remains in the doll, the more human the doll will become. So Chucky demands to John that he helps him reverse the spell, but unfortunately refuses, stating that Chucky's soul transfer violated everything that he was taught about voodoo. So Chucky decides he's going to torture John with a voodoo doll, which forces him to reveal that the only way to escape the doll's body is for Chucky to transfer his soul to the first human he revealed his true identity to, which of course is Andy. So Chucky stabs the voodoo doll in the chest, which totally kills John, and he escapes to go find Andy. Karen and Norris end up showing up shortly after and find John before he passes away. John tells them that in order for them to kill Chucky, they have to strike him at his heart. So Chucky arrives now at the psychiatric hospital where Andy's being held, and he ends up killing a doctor with an electric shock therapy device, and chaos begins to ensue. During this chaos, Andy escapes and flees home, but Chucky follows closely behind him and knocks him out. This is where Chucky prepares to possess Andy with the voodoo chant. However, at the same time, Karen and Norris show up. Karen and Andy manage to trap Chucky in the fireplace and light him on fire, but Chucky rises up and begins chasing Andy. Karen shoots Chucky repeatedly, which blows him to pieces. Norris's partner Jack shows up and at first refuses to believe any of them that the doll was alive and caused all this chaos. However, Chucky's body bursts through the vent and strangles Jack. Karen manages to tear Chucky off of Jack, and Norris shoots Chucky's body right through the heart, finally killing him. They then leave the room, with Andy turning back to look at Chucky's remains. And that ends us off for Child's Play, which is a very interesting ending for a horror movie during the 80s, because horror movies wanted to become franchises. That's just my opinion. Like, if a horror movie was coming out in the 80s, you wanted it to be a franchise because it was making so much money at the time. Yet, Child's Play didn't feel like it wanted to be a franchise. There was no ambiguous ending. There was no tease at the end saying that Chucky was still alive. For all intents and purposes, Chucky's dead. And there's no reason or way that a sequel could happen. So people watching this probably didn't expect Child's Play 2 to drop. And I bet they didn't expect to develop it either. But when you've made tens of millions of dollars on a movie, well, it's going to become a franchise. You better get ready for the sequel. So that wraps us up for our 1988 horror movie review. Now to head into the final year of the 80s, 1989. And we're going to review a movie that was so iconic and to this day is totally terrifying. We're going to talk about Pet Sematary. I love Pet Sematary. I'm not a fan of the reboot. I shouldn't say this because I said I wouldn't do Pearl, but I'll probably never do the reboot on here because, man, that reboot was bad. I did not like what they did with the reboot of Pet Sematary, but that's just my opinion. We're going to talk about the OG, the best Pet Sematary film. So when it came to horror adaptations in the 80s, King was king, right? Like, Stephen King was the king. Carrie, Salem's Lot, Christine, The Shining. There were so many horror movies that were based off of Stephen King books in the 80s. However, this started to die down near mid to the late 80s, where apparently a lot of people felt that there was no more demand for Stephen King films. And the film rights for Pet Sematary, they were sold to George A. Romero in 1984 for $10,000. So George A. Romero almost developed a Pet Sematary movie, which I think would have been pretty freaking cool, to be honest with you. That would have been an awesome adaptation of Pet Sematary if George A. Romero was on it. Unfortunately, though, King had previously declined several other offers for a film adaptation, so Romero eventually had to pull out of the production. Development executive Lindsay Doran loved the script so much, and she advocated for it to be made at Embassy Pictures and then again at Paramount Pictures. However, she was told each time that there was no demand for Stephen King films, but it was the 1988 Writers Guild of America strike that caused Paramount to reconsider. There was a shortage of new productions for 1989 releases, and the script for Pet Sematary was finished and ready to go. So, of course, it got the green light, and they put it together so it could be released for 1989. The original cut of the film was delivered to Paramount's executives, and they said that it was just too long, so excess footage needed to be removed. The original ending scene was also more ambiguous than what we got. It showed only the undead Rachel entering the kitchen where Louis is playing solitaire, which left his fate uncertain. When Stephen King sold the rights for Pet Sematary, he added a stipulation into it that, for one, it had to be shot in Maine where the story was set, and that Stephen King himself wrote the screenplay. Which I think is pretty fair, right? Like, if you're an artist, you're an author, right? Like, writing a book is an art, right? You want your art to be portrayed as accurately as possible. You don't want, a book that's set in Maine to be filmed in Bulgaria. The house that was used for the Creed's home was a private residence near Hancock, while Judd's house, across the street, was actually a facade. It was constructed around an existing house that was insulated with fireproof material so that the mock up could eventually be burned around it. The interiors of the Creed house were recreated on a soundstage in Ellsworth, while the interiors of Judd's house were built inside the Bangor Arsenal. And the budget of this film we know is $11.5 million. So let's take a look and see what it made at the box office. Because it made bank at the box office. It grossed $57.5 million in the US alone, for a total worldwide gross of $89.5 million. No wonder there was a Pet Sematary 2. I've never seen it though. I just want to put that out there. I know that there's a Pet Sematary 2, but I have not seen Pet Sematary 2. And I will probably never see Pet Sematary 2. And I have a reason for that. Because Pet Sematary 2 is obviously a cash grab film. Stephen King wrote Pet Sematary. He wrote a book, the story's there. He did not write a sequel. So if you're doing a sequel to Pet Sematary, it's not the original work. It's not the work of King. So why do I give a shit? What makes you think this is going to be good? So I've never seen it, and I know it was released to pretty poor reviews and a disappointing box office. And the reason I know that is because, well, it didn't spawn a third one. There's no Pet Sematary franchise. They did the sequel, it tanked, and they fucking cut the cord. Well, let's dive in. Let's talk about our final 80s movie in our Decade in Review series, Pet Sematary. We start the film off by meeting the Creed family. Louis, Rachel, their children Ellie and Cage, along with their pet cat Church. They move from Chicago to rural Ludlow, Maine, after Louis accepts a job as a physician with the University of Maine. They befriend their neighbor Judd Crandall, who takes them to an isolated pet cemetery in the forest behind the Creeds' new home. Louis encounters Victor Pascow, who's a jogger that gets mortally injured after being hit by a truck. He warns him of the pet cemetery before dying. However, he called Louis by his name, despite the fact that they had never met before. Later that night, Pascow appears to him as a ghost and leads him towards the pet cemetery. He warns him not to cross the barrier because the ground beyond it is quote-unquote sour. Louis awakens assuming that it was all a dream, but notices that his feet are covered in dirt. It's now Thanksgiving, and the family goes away to celebrate the holiday, and their cat Church gets run down on the highway. Realizing that Ellie's going to be devastated because of the loss of her cat, Judd ends up taking Louis beyond the pet cemetery and deep into the woods, where they reach an ancient burial ground. Judd instructs Louis to bury the cat and warns him not to tell anyone about what they have done. The next day, Church shows up at the house. A reanimated Church returns to the house. He stinks, he's moving a little more sluggish, and his eyes, glow gold, and he's a little vicious towards Louis. But Judd explains that as a boy, he revived his own pet dog, and that although the cat, might be different, it will save Ellie the grief of losing her pet. However, sometime later, the story takes a very dark turn, because his son Gage ends up getting killed by a truck on the same highway. So Judd anticipates that Louis is going to consider burying his son in the ancient burial ground, but Louis denies that this is his plan. Judd believes that introducing Louis to the ritual ground aroused the malevolent forces that are present there, which caused Cage's death. He tells him that the story of a local man named Bill Baderman, who buried his son Timmy in the ancient burial ground after he was killed in World War II. Timmy returned as a zombie, terrifying the townsfolk, and a group of men, including Judd, tried to destroy Timmy by lighting the Baderman house on fire, only for Bill to perish along with his son. Judd insists that the burial ground's evil and Louis must not bury his son there. After the funeral, Rachel and Ellie leave for Chicago while Louis remains home. Now, despite the warnings from Pascow and Judd, Louis exhumes his son's body and begins to bury him at the ancient burial ground. Back in Chicago, Pascow appears to Ellie in a dream and warns her that Louis is about to do something terrible. Rachel's unnerved by hearing about her daughter's dream, but can only reach Judd when she ends up calling, saying that Louis is not home. She decides that she's going to return to Maine, much to Judd's alarm. That same night, Gage returns home, reanimated, and steals a scalpel from his father's bag. This scene, man, just talking about this scene. If you've seen Pet Sematary, you know what is about to happen here. And this scene is probably, outside of the ending, is the only scene that haunts me from Pet Sematary. Because Gage has a scalpel. He taunts Judd before slashing his Achilles tendon and his mouth before biting his throat and killing him. It was a crazy, crazy kill scene. So now Rachel's returned home, and she gets lured into Judd's house by the voice inspector of her dead sister, Zelda, only to discover that she's actually seen Gage holding a scalpel. She's shocked, she doesn't know what's going on. She reaches down to hug her son, and he ends up killing her. Louis wakes up from his sleep and notices that Gage's muddy footprints are all over the house and discovers that, well, his scalpel is missing as well. He receives a phone call from Gage saying that he played with Judd and Mommy. He fills 3 syringes with morphine and heads to Judd's house. Gage ends up taunting his dad further, and Louis is startled by Rachel's body hanging from the attic before Gage attacks him. There's a brief battle between the two, but Louis overpowers Gage and injects him with the morphine syringe. He then lights Judd's house on fire, leaving it to burn as he carries his wife's body to the burial ground. Pascal appears and warns him not to make it worse, but of course he's completely grief-stricken to the point of insanity and believes that he waited too long when he buried Gage. But burying Rachel will work this time because she just died hours ago. That same night, of course, Rachel returns to Louis and the couple embrace when Rachel takes a large knife from the counter before Louis screams. And that ends off Pet Sematary. The ending is haunting for me. Like that scene where she comes in looking all fucked up in this. She stands in the kitchen, the two of them embrace, and she just grabs the knife and the movie ends. I'm like, oh, like what did you expect? Like, what did you expect? But it's a great story on grief. Pet Sematary is a great story on how far someone will go when they're grieving to just make everything go back to normal, bring back their loved ones, and just not have to suffer that feeling of grief. Because it is one of the most powerful human emotions to have to suffer grief and the loss of a loved one. So this is a great story, a great tale on what a person is willing to do and how far they're willing to go to bring that loved one back and not have to grieve for them. Great story. I love Pet Sematary. I love the book. I love the movie. I hate the reboot. They fucked up the reboot, but we're not going to talk about that. But anyways, that wraps us up for not only this episode of the podcast, not only the 80s Decade in Review, but it wraps us up for Season 2. We are officially done Season 2 of the podcast. I want to take a moment to thank all of you. Everyone who has listened even to just one episode of the podcast. Thank you so much. We're creeping up to our 1-year anniversary of Cabin of Horrors next month. We're about a month away now. I'm pretty sure my first episode was April 22nd. It was when it released. That is our 1-year anniversary of Cabin of Horrors. And we're celebrating with a brand new project that you've probably heard about, Nightmare on the 13th. That is going to be live on Twitch April 13th. So if you haven't yet, come over to my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/Cabin of Horrors. I will be going live on the 13th to present to you all